Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. My name is Marjay, and for this segment of Authors at Google, I have the pleasure of introducing Jeremy Scahill. So I had the privilege of meeting Jeremy at this year's Sundance Film Festival after watching the premiere of his new documentary film, Dirty Wars, which he co-wrote and produced. This talk is pretty timely due to the US military tactics being a hot topic in the news today. So we've all been really anticipating his visit with us to discuss his new book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. So I'm gonna brag about Jeremy a little bit here. So Jeremy Scahill is National Security Correspondent for The Nation magazine and is a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. Jeremy has reported from around the world in countries such as Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, Nigeria, and Yemen. Jeremy is also author of the New York Times bestseller Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy's courageous work has sparked several congressional investigations and won some of journalism's highest honors. He was twice awarded the George Polk Award in 1998 for foreign reporting, and in 2008 for his book Blackwater. I found this quote online the other day, and I really think it sums up Jeremy pretty perfectly. There is no journalist in America who has exposed the truth about US government militarism more bravely, more relentlessly, and more valuably than Jeremy Scahill. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming Jeremy Scahill to Talks at Google.
It's really great to be with all of you. I mean, I use so many Google products that to actually be here is a bit surreal. And I'm hoping that one of you has access to the servers, because I'd like to permanently delete some of my emails from a few years ago. If someone can help facilitate that, I've tried very hard to figure out how to do it. So come see me afterwards. It's also interesting because, in looking at the U.S. drone program, of course, you almost never hear any U.S. officials publicly acknowledge that the U.S. is engaged in drone bombing around the world. And the first time that I'm aware of that President Obama actually addressed the issue was on a Google Plus Hangout, where he was asked a question by a young person about the drone program, and he answered it. And it was in this Hangout that he did at the White House, which is interesting because at the time they wouldn't talk to journalists about it, but then when he did the Hangout, he talked about it. So I've often joked that the new way that we declassify information in our society is for somehow to have officials go on Google Plus Hangouts or late night talk shows, which is primarily how this administration has discussed the more covert aspects of its wars. I think we're living in a moment where I think we're going to look back years from now and realize that there were things done during the course of the Obama administration that ended up solidifying as sort of permanent fixtures of U.S. national security policy some of the worst aspects of what many people attribute to the Bush-Cheney era. And because you have a popular constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning Democratic president in office, continuing some of the policies that many liberals opposed when they were being enacted by Bush and Cheney, the chances of sort of dismantling the counterterrorism apparatus that's been built up over the past two administrations is going to be very unlikely. I think that we are now in an era where the Obama administration has made assassination a central part of what is called U.S. national security policy. And if McCain had won the election in 2008, I don't believe for a moment that you would have been seeing polls indicating that 70% of self-identified liberals support drone strikes, and that support for those strikes drops only negligibly when the target in question is an American citizen. I think that President Obama has effectively sold the concept to liberals, to the liberal base, that he's waging a smarter war and a cleaner war where there are strikes that are surgically taking out terrorists that are plotting against the United States. And I think that a lot of the trust that people place in Obama is going to come back to haunt us when a Marco Rubio is in office or a Jeb Bush is in office, and they say, well, you guys can't say anything to us because when Obama was doing it, you were cheering it on. And I think in sort of looking at the 5 years of the Obama administration, I've sort of come to the conclusion that our real principles, what we actually believe, is not tested when when someone that we sort of loathe is in office. It's easy to be against Dick Cheney, and I do sort of imagine him as this Darth Vader character in his lair, plotting the destruction of the world so that Halliburton stocks can go up. But I think that Obama is different. I think that President Obama believes sincerely that he's doing that he's engaged in the most effective way to keep the country safe. And I certainly disagree with that conclusion, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why in the countries where I've traveled and sort of how I see these covert wars unfolding and the impact that they're going to have. But we're not tested when someone that's easy to hate or oppose is in office. That's almost sort of cartoonishly devilish in his presentation. Your principles are tested when someone that you actually like is in office or that you may have voted for. And when you look at the policies and say, I like this person as a political leader and I'm inspired by him, but I'm against these particular policies. That's what principle is. You don't cede your conscience to a political figure. Then you're not actually engaged in fighting for a better country. You're allowing you're ceding your ability to make decisions or formulate principles to a partisan political figure. Right now, the U.S., we don't know how many countries the U.S. is at war in or at war against. There are, by some estimates, U.S. Special Operations Forces deployed in 75 to 100 countries around the world. And that doesn't mean that we're doing drone strikes there or cruise missile strikes. In some cases, there's a very small covert presence, and they're doing night raids or snatching individuals that are deemed to be threats or bumping people off. In some of the countries, there are drone strikes. In many of them, the relationship is that the U.S. is sending some of its most elite commandos to embed with or train or facilitate the actions of local government forces in places like Yemen. For instance, the United States has built up a counterterrorism unit there. And it can become problematic when you build up these units with tremendous American technology and brain power and then expect that they're going to be fighting al-Qaeda, when what ends up happening at the end of the day is that these elite U.S. trained forces are used to defend a failing or flailing regime. And that certainly happened in Yemen, and it sparked tremendous amount of anger in Yemen that this elite force that the U.S. built up of Yemenis to target al-Qaeda actually was used to defend the regime when the Arab Spring was happening. In Somalia, I went to Mogadishu, which at the time was in the summer of 2011. There was incredibly fierce fighting in Mogadishu. A militant movement called al-Shabaab was in control of roughly 50% of the capital, and by some estimates 40 to 60% of the rest of Somalia. And they were fighting against a network of U.S.-funded warlords, some of whom had actually been allies of al-Qaeda in an earlier iteration in their lives, and they're now on the U.S. payroll as sort of proxy forces to hunt down people that the U.S. has deemed to be Islamist radicals or within the leadership of al-Qaeda in East Africa or in al-Shabaab. And there's also a massive African Union peacekeeping force, primarily made up of Ugandan and Burundian soldiers that are funded, trained, equipped, armed by the United States. And when I flew into the airport, into Adenade International Airport, when we landed on the ground and we were taxiing, I noticed this huge structure that looked to me like a forward operating base that you would see in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. And it appeared to be relatively new construction. And there was basically like a small village inside of it of houses and administrative looking buildings. And then there were some small hangars for aircraft. And when I met up with my Somali contact, who was going to take us around Mogadishu for a couple of weeks and hopefully keep us alive, I said, what's that building? And he said, oh, that's Guantanamo. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, oh, that's where the Americans are. We call it Guantanamo. And I said, well, what goes on there? And he said, well, the Americans are training Somali forces there, and then they go out and do operations in the city. And to me, it was sort of incredible. I'd never heard of this. This is under the Obama administration. There's this base that, it's the worst kept secret in Somalia that the Americans have a base at the airport. Not the greatest place to stick a covert base for counterterrorism operations, but nonetheless, there it was. And I ended up investigating what goes on at that base and found Somalis who were liaising with the CIA, and they were from this sort of fragile government that existed in Mogadishu, and they were working with the CIA and U.S. military intelligence to hunt down and target the leadership of al-Shabaab. And one Somali agent described to me how the Americans would line up the Somali operatives that they were working with in training and pay them $200 a month in cash to serve as this kind of hit force within the country. I also discovered that there's a prison in the basement of Somalia's US-backed and US-funded National Security Service, which is their main intelligence service, and that in the basement of this prison, there are people that have been snatched from other countries in East Africa and taken there in rendition flights, some of which have been directed by the United States. So the Obama administration or the CIA will instruct the Kenyan military or Kenyan secret police to go and snatch someone from a neighborhood in Nairobi and take them to Wilson Airport and then shackle them, hood them, and fly them to Somalia, where they're then put in this prison and interrogated at times by U.S. Personnel, intelligence or military personnel. And I met a journalist who was put in that prison for filming an operation that the government didn't want him to film, and he told me that there were Americans in there that were interrogating prisoners. And then we discovered, we had smuggled out of that prison the testimony of a guy who had been kidnapped in Kenya and taken to that prison because the Americans believed that he had information on one of the senior leaders of al-Qaeda in East Africa. And they took him out of his home in Kenya, flew him there, and then he was being interrogated repeatedly by American agents. And the journalist described the prison to me as infested with bed bugs, no natural light. Prisoners are never allowed outside. None of them have access to lawyers. In many cases, their family members don't even know that they're there, including people that have been taken from countries outside of Somalia. And I'm telling you this story because when President Obama was first elected, he issued a series of executive orders. One was to close the U.S. prison at Guantanamo in Cuba. Another was to dismantle the network of secret CIA prisons in countries like Poland or Thailand or elsewhere. And then another was aimed at ending the practice of torture, or what the Bush-Cheney administration liked to call enhanced interrogation techniques. And President Obama said that our interrogation methods are going to conform to the U.S. Army Field Manual, and that we're not going to be using techniques such as waterboarding on prisoners and putting them in boxes with insects and other things that happened under the Bush-Cheney era. But what actually has happened is that the Obama administration has sort of tweaked some of the program and has rebranded it as a sort of more humane, lawful approach to counterterrorism. So instead of snatching someone ourselves and putting them in a CIA Cessna and flying them to Thailand or Poland or elsewhere and to put them in a CIA black site, we are instructing other governments to abduct the people for us or snatch or pick up the people that we want taken, and then to fly them to a prison that's not run by the United States, it's run by something resembling a government in Somalia, and then our intelligence operatives have access to these prisoners. So is it different from the Bush-Cheney era? Yes, it is. It's that they've outsourced some of the aspects of the program. But rendition continues under Obama. The use of prisons that are secret and human rights abuses are still happening at the request of the United States government. And so I think that the Obama administration can say we've shut down all of these things, and it's true, they have, but they've found a way to continue them through a sort of backdoor approach. Now, the president has failed to close Guantanamo, not just because he hasn't fought hard enough on it. Republicans have been blocking funding. But one of the results of the sort of Guantanamo issue festering and the fact that there are 27 people now that are being force-fed in Guantanamo, they're on hunger strike, many of the prisoners have already been cleared for release, and the U.S. refuses to release those individuals. President Obama doesn't want to stick more people in Guantanamo. Every time they try to prosecute someone on terrorism charges in the civilian courts, the Republicans go bananas. They want them treated as enemy combatants. They don't want them to have access to Miranda rights. So what we've seen, a pattern that we've seen, is that instead of focusing on capturing these individuals and trying to bring them to justice in our civilian court system, the program has in many cases become just a kill program. It used to be kill capture, and the capture part of it resulted in secret prisons and Guantanamo and military commissions. And so it's more convenient and expedient in the eyes of the administration to just start killing the people that the U.S. suspects are plotting acts of terror against the United States. Now, having been in Somalia and traveled in areas that are under the control of al-Qaeda in Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere, I know firsthand that there are people plotting to kill Americans. These are real plots. They want to blow up our airplanes. They want to poison water supplies. They want to set off bombs in Times Square or elsewhere. I mean, this is real. This is not some invented threat. I mean, there are dangerous groups of people that are plotting these things. And I believe that as a nation, we have a right to defend ourselves. So I'm not a pacifist. But my concern is that in the pursuit of a relatively small group of people who are plotting against the United States, we are actually creating more new enemies than we are killing actual terrorists. I don't know if many of you have heard of this policy that has been popularized under President Obama with the approach to drones, but it's called signature strikes. And it started in Pakistan and is now expanded to Yemen. And to me, it's sort of a grotesque form of pre-crime. It's sort of like Minority Report, where if you are a military-aged male in a certain region of Pakistan or a certain region of Yemen, and you are with a group of other military-aged males, and someone in that group has been in phone contact with someone that the United States is watching as a potential terrorist, or you visited a certain building where the U.S. has been monitoring a suspected terrorist, they will create a pattern of life and preemptively determine that those people, because of who they're associated with and where they reside, and the fact that they're males, that they are terrorists. And so when the U.S. kills them, then they declare them as terrorists, even when they don't know the identities of the people that they're killing or have any actual evidence that they're engaged in terror plots. And the impact of this on the ground has been to enrage tribal leaders and ordinary people, Bedouin villagers and others, who don't understand why the United States is killing them, and the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula are still walking around as free men. Saad al-Shiri, one of the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, has been killed 12 times this year by the United States. He was killed a few weeks ago, just before he released a new audio tape referencing current events. And you know, the point I'm making is that, you know, the number 3 guy at al-Qaeda, we've killed them a bunch of times, but these guys in Yemen, who are supposedly the most dangerous leaders of the organization, have not been killed, and a tremendous number of civilians have been killed. So I was hearing from Yemenis when I was traveling in these tribal areas in the south, you know, you call al-Qaeda terrorism. We say your drones are terrorism. You know, and for them, they're right. We are the terrorists to them because they don't understand the logic of why we're drone bombing their villages. Many of these tribes are not inclined to support al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has been a threat to them as well, and they don't want they don't want to be at war with the United States. It's not in their interest. It's not in their tribal interest. It's not in their national interest. And so instead of taking an approach where we could work with some of the tribes who are predisposed to despise al-Qaeda, we are pushing them into the fold of, if not supporting al-Qaeda, taking up a mentality of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you know, so I think I started this at the beginning by saying that I think that a lot of liberals believe that Obama's waging a smarter, cleaner war, because on the Google Plus Hangout, Obama said, you know, that the numbers of civilians killed has been exaggerated and that it actually is a relatively small group of people. Those of us that have been going to these countries as journalists and reporting on it, all have come across stories that are just shocking in the number of civilians that have actually been killed. And so, you know, you can argue that drone strikes are a smarter alternative to big military deployments, but Obama was never considering sending in troops to Yemen. So it's sort of a false choice that a lot of people put forward. But also to say that it's a smarter policy and a more effective policy and a cleaner policy without acknowledging the potential for blowback that these strikes are causing is to only tell part of the story. And so in order to have an actual debate in this country about what a real national security policy would look like, we would actually have to have a full assessment of who actually has been killed in the drone strikes. Because when we're doing signature strikes and we don't know who the people are, we don't have actual evidence that they're engaged in a real plot, I think we're ultimately undermining our own national security because we're giving a new generation of people a legitimate reason to want to harm Americans. You know, this is not about our freedom or our McDonald's. This is you killed my family. And revenge is a very, very powerful motivator. And I fear that we are going to pay for this, if not in the next few years, sometime down the line. You know, one of the things we all have to, when we look at the history of how did 9/11 happen, you know, if we want to really face the facts, 9/11 happened in part as a result of U.S. foreign policy. And it was a response to what was a widely held perception that the U.S. was at war against Islam and that the United States was an unquestioning supporter of Israel's activities in the Middle East and against the Palestinians. It was not just some sort of comic book version of they hate our freedom. And I think we don't study history at our own peril. You know, we have to learn from these events. And I think that the people that will pay the price for it are not going to be folks in the U.S. military or political leaders in the U.S. It's going to be American tourists somewhere, or it's going to be kids at a sporting event. You know, and I fear for the impact that our policies are going to have down the line. We really crossed a line, I think, in this continuation of the Bush-era policies, in late 2011, there were a series of strikes that were authorized by President Obama in Yemen. One was on September 30th, 2011, and then the other was on October 14th, 2011, where 3 U.S. citizens were killed in drone strikes. And the main target of the first drone strike was this guy named Anwar Awlaki. And I'm sure many of you have seen some clip or something from his videos that have been posted on YouTube or elsewhere, where you see this guy with a big beard, with a camouflage jacket, in front of a black flag, calling for armed jihad against the United States, and calling on young people, young Muslims in Western countries to rise up within their own countries, whether it's the United States or Britain, and plot attacks, or to come to Afghanistan or Yemen or Somalia to join the fronts of jihad. Well, Anwar Awlaki has a fascinating story, and it really is part of the spine of my book. I got to know his family very well, and his father is actually an extraordinary man, this guy named Dr. Nasser Awlaki, who is one of the leading, he's an agricultural engineer and one of the leading people in Yemen trying to work on the country's water crisis. Yemen may be the first country in the world to completely run out of water. And this man spent his entire life trying to address that problem. And he came to the US, Dr. Nasser Awlaki, in 1966 as a Fulbright scholar. And he showed me this essay that he wrote when he was a young student, and he said in it that he was mesmerized by the progressivism of America, and that he wanted to be a part of it, and that he wanted to get an American education and live his life according to the American spirit, and then go back to Yemen and contribute to improving the lives of his countrymen. So he comes here in '66, and he's studying at New Mexico State University, and he ends up getting his degree very quickly, and then moves on to getting a master's degree. And his wife comes over and joins him, and she got her GED in the United States, and she was working at a candy factory to help support her husband while he was getting his education. And in 1971, they had their first child, Anwar Awlaki, who was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And Nasser told me, at the time you could smoke cigars in the hospitals, and he passed out It's a Boy cigars. And they really wanted to raise Anwar as an American, and they were contemplating staying in the United States. And they moved to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and Nasser took a job at a university there, and Anwar went to grade school and went to the YMCA, and they took trips to Disneyland, and his first language was English. And when Anwar was 7, the family moved back to Yemen so that Nasser could take a job building up the Department of Agricultural Engineering at Sana'a University. And he did that with millions of dollars in support from the US government, and he worked closely with USAID. And Anwar went to a school in Yemen that was bilingual, and he went to school at the elite of the country, including the children of the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. Some of his classmates in that school would go on to be the people the U.S. worked with to try to kill Anwar Awlaki. He graduates from high school and then wants to go back to the U.S. to go to university. And he goes to Colorado just as the Gulf War was starting in 1991. And at that time, Anwar Awlaki was not a religious guy. He was going to study engineering. I remember myself, I was 16 when the Gulf War started, and it was the first time that I really came face to face with the fact that the U.S. is engaged in these wars. And I remember being actually afraid. You heard Bernard Shaw on the phone under a desk for CNN, and Peter Arnett, and I was shocked that there was someone actually named Wolf Blitzer who was reporting from the Pentagon. And Awlaki sort of became politicized by that war, and he started doing some anti-war organizing, and was invited by a local mosque in Colorado to come and give a lecture. And the imam at the mosque was quite taken with him and said, you have a real gift for speech. I think you should continue to come back. And Anwar started to spend more and more time at this mosque, and decided that he didn't want to be an engineer, but that he wanted to study Islam, and that he wanted to become an imam. And so he began a course of Islamic scholarship, and ultimately did become an imam. And while in Denver, Colorado, his eldest son was born, Abdul Rahman, in 1995. And so Anwar and his family are in Denver, then they moved to San Diego, and he's an imam at a mosque in San Diego. And when 9/11 happened, Anwar Awlaki was the imam at a large Islamic center in Falls Church, Virginia, called the Dar al-Hijra Mosque. And I remember Awlaki after 9/11 because I was working as a radio producer, and I remember seeing him on PBS and hearing him on NPR and reading about him in the Washington Post. Awlaki was a very public figure after 9/11 and was much in demand in the corporate media because he was helping to make sense of the experience that I think was common among many American Muslims, where you were horrified at the attacks, wanted justice, like I think all of us did, and those who did it to be brought to justice, but also facing this intense hatred and bigotry and Muslim businesses were being attacked, taxi drivers, non-Muslims who people thought were Muslims, like Sikhs and others, were being attacked. There was this real, I'm sure we all remember it, this real climate of fear. And the day after September 11th, a woman stumbled into Awlaki's mosque, a Muslim woman, after being attacked with a baseball bat. And Muslim organizations and charities were being raided. The FBI was putting pressure on imams to become informants for the government. All of this was playing out, and Awlaki was a prolific speaker and commentator in the media, and he balanced these two worlds. And he said the United States has a right to go into Afghanistan and get those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And he said that the fact that U.S. policy, pro-Israel policy, or what the United States had done in Iraq during the 90s with its economic sanctions and the deaths that it caused, that none of that justifies the killing of one U.S. civilian in New York or at the Pentagon. And he said this very publicly, and you can go back and find some of his speeches. In fact, he was considered to be such a part of mainstream American dialogue at the time that he was invited by the Pentagon to come and speak at a luncheon on the state of Islam in the world today. And in fact did go and deliver a lecture at the Pentagon shortly after 9/11. And we got the documents on his visit, and I mentioned this in the book. You can tell how bad the U.S. intelligence was at the time, because among the things they served was a bacon sandwich at the event that day. When they invite an imam to come and speak at the Pentagon and serve bacon sandwiches. One of the only, I guess, humorous moments in my book. But what ended up happening is that Awlaki was very much radicalized by the U.S. wars, by the invasion of Iraq, by the images that came out of Abu Ghraib and the use of the Guantanamo prison. And his sermons started to become sharper and sharper, and he ultimately leaves the United States and goes back to Yemen. And he is recording these audio messages, and they're becoming very popular among young Muslims around the world. And his tapes start to pop up in a number of terror investigations in Britain, in the US, and Canada. And US intelligence is becoming concerned that, not that Awlaki is directly involved with plots, but that his message, his words, are inspiring lone wolf terrorists or small cells of maybe unaffiliated potential terrorists to attack public transportation sites in the UK or in the US. And they first have Awlaki on their radar in 2005, 2006. In 2006, Awlaki's in Yemen, in Sana'a, living with his family and his father's family, and he's taking classes and he's recording sermons, and then one day he is abducted by Yemen's US-trained counterterrorism force and the secret police, and they stick Anwar Awlaki in prison for 18 months. And 17 of them he spends in solitary confinement. And he believed that the United States was responsible for his imprisonment. And when the United Nations investigated it, they said that his detention was extra-legal. And I found out through my reporting that Awlaki was in fact in prison at the direction of John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence and knows a lot about dirty wars from his time in Central America in the 80s, when he was a major figure in facilitating support for the Contra death squads in Nicaragua and Battalion 316 in Honduras. But Negroponte met with a Yemeni official and with Bandar Bush, the famed Saudi diplomat whose nickname is Bandar Bush because he's so close to the Bush family, and said that the position of the U.S. is that they want Awlaki kept in prison in Yemen for 4 or 5 years so that people forget about him. And that he's not able to keep recording these sermons. And I reviewed Awlaki's prison writings, and they gave him very few books in prison. He hated Shakespeare, thought Shakespeare was an imperialist. He loved Dickens and would compare figures in the U.S. government and the Yemeni government to Uriah Heep and other characters. But he also started to read the literature of very radical Islamic thinkers or scholars, and including some of the people that were the framers of the concept that bin Laden used as an inspiration to form al-Qaeda. And he ends up being released from prison after 18 months because of pressure from legal organizations in Yemen and his tribe, which is very powerful, the Awlak tribe in Yemen. So he's forced to be released by the Yemeni government because of the political pressure within the country. And he comes out of prison a changed man. He's fully blown radical. And he starts a blog called Imam Anwar's blog, and the internet becomes his mosque. And he starts to celebrate attacks against U.S. forces in various countries and engages in discussions about whether suicide bombing is permissible under Islamic teachings and the Quran. And ultimately, he comes out on the side that suicide bombings are acceptable in war. And he's Basically, the U.S. wants him shut down. They're pressuring the Yemeni government to rearrest him. The house is being surveilled, and Awlaki decides that he's going to go underground. So he leaves the capital of Sana'a, goes to Shabwa province in southern Yemen, where his family is originally from, and he continues to record his sermons there. The head of Yemen's intelligence agency comes to Dr. Nasser Awlaki, who's a very esteemed figure in Yemeni society, and they say, look, Nasser, if you don't get Anwar to come back to Sana'a and go back into the prison, the Americans are going to kill him with a drone. This was in April, May 2009. And so Nasser, not wanting his son to be killed and feeling like there's no evidence that he's doing anything, yes, he's engaged in this radical speech, but my son's not a terrorist. He's a guy whose views in the world I don't share, but I respect his freedom of speech. He goes down to meet with his son and says, they're going to kill you if you don't come back and go to prison. And Anwar sort of angrily says to his father, what, are you working for the Americans now? I'm not going to let them tell me which way to put my bed when I sleep at night. I was born free, I'm going to die free. And that was the last conversation that his father had with him. So Nasser goes back, and he's raising Anwar's family. There are these 3 kids, including the eldest son, who was born in Denver, Colorado. And Anwar's underground. The U.S. starts to hunt for him. The first time that the U.S. tried to kill him was in December of 2009. And what really sealed Awlaki's fate was when Major Nidal Hasan shot up and massacred more than a dozen of his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas, if you remember, in November 2009. And it emerged that Awlaki had been in email touch with Nidal Hasan. And to this day, the story persists that Awlaki had something to do with the Fort Hood massacre. But the emails have now been declassified, and if you read them, U.S. intelligence, by the way, believe that he did not have anything to do with the Fort Hood massacre. But if you look at the declassified emails, Nidal Hasan was almost like a creepy stalker and was sending Awlaki these notes saying, I want to give you a prize of $5,000. I want to have an essay contest in your name. At one point, he asks Awlaki to help him find a Yemeni bride. And Awlaki's like, yeah, I'll keep an eye out for a brother. But he basically is sort of batting him away and treating him kind of like a stalker. And Hasan, has an interesting story that often doesn't get told. He was an army psychiatrist who had been interviewing Afghan and Iraq war vets, and he actually tried to have some of them prosecuted for war crimes up his chain of command for the things that they had told him during their therapy sessions, and was clearly a guy that was on a path toward doing something like this. But Awlaki, it seems, did not have anything to do with the attack, but the fact that he had been in email touch with him became relevant. And then the day after the Fort Hood massacre, Awlaki posted a blog post that said Nidal Hasan is a hero and called on other Muslims in the military to do the same thing that Nidal Hasan had done. And that's when the campaign to try to kill Anwar Awlaki just intensified. Then when the underwear bomber happened, this deranged young Nigerian guy, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, tried to bring down the U.S. airplane by setting his underpants on fire on Christmas Day 2009. After that, it turned out that Awlaki had been in contact with him, and Awlaki at one point said he was my student, but I didn't direct him to do that, but I know him and I support what he did. And so from December of 2009 until September of 2011, by my count, the U.S. tried to kill Anwar Awlaki more than a dozen times. And there were several very near misses, some of which are sort of like out of a spy movie where they have Awlaki's vehicle, they're tracking it in the desert. They shoot a Hellfire missile from a Predator drone. It misses. Awlaki calls for backup. There's a smoke dust up. These guys come to pick him up. They switch vehicles and drive off in different directions. And the CIA ends up blowing up the guys that come to rescue him, and Awlaki gets away. And so there's this intense hunt for him going on. And behind the scenes, there's this incredible story, and I tell it in my book. While the U.S. is hunting Awlaki, this Danish guy named Morten Storm, also known as Murad Storm, which is sort of an amazing name given what I'm about to tell you. He goes to the Danish intelligence service, the PET, and he says, "You're looking, the Americans are looking for Anwar Awlaki. I can help you find him." He's like, "I was an old friend of Awlaki's back in Yemen. We were in school together, and we were close." And Morten Storm was a former motorcycle gangster with a long criminal record who converted to Islam and was sort of an aspiring jihadist. And he had gotten to know Awlaki in Yemen in 2004, 2005. And so Storm goes to the Danish intelligence and says, I can help you. The Danish intelligence service then calls in the CIA, and the CIA, Danish intelligence, and this guy, Morten Storm, concoct a plot to find Anwar Awlaki a new wife to have while he's underground. And Morten Storm emails Awlaki in encrypted emails and says he wants to help him find a wife. And Awlaki agrees and wants to do this. So they literally put an ad on Facebook for a wife. And it's like jihadist OkCupid or something. So they put an ad on Facebook, and they get all these responses from women. And this young woman from Croatia who was a Catholic who converted to Islam, named Amina, ends up being selected as the wife. Now, she has no idea that she's part of a CIA plot. She thinks she's going to marry Anwar Awlaki and says, I'm prepared to die, and I want to marry you. And Awlaki and Amina exchange these videos back and forth, and the videos have now been made public, and you can see they're sort of like Skype dating or something for a while, and eventually. She says, yes, I'm going to go and marry him. And so the CIA paid for everything. They buy her plane ticket. They bought her luggage that had tracking devices in it. And the plan was that she's going to fly to Yemen with the CIA tracking device Louis Vuitton bags. And then she's going to go meet up with Anwar Awlaki, and the U.S. is going to kill both of them in a drone strike. Which, I mean, there's such a morally reprehensible aspect to that story. I mean, this woman didn't know, that she was being used in this way. But sort of the tables turned when she arrives in Yemen, and Awlaki's guys go to pick her up at the airport, and they force her to ditch the bags and her clothes and give her new clothes. So the bags and clothes that the CIA provided for her remain in Sana'a, and she disappears into the wilderness of Yemen and actually marries Anwar Awlaki and has a child with him. So it's like the CIA's dating service. They found this bride for Anwar Awlaki, and she's still alive to this day. I think she writes for Inspire magazine, which is the publication of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But eventually, the U.S. finds Anwar Awlaki in September of 2011, and they've located him in the north of Yemen. They'd been looking all in the south of Yemen. They find him. He's in the north of Yemen, and he's with another American citizen, this Pakistani American named Samir Khan, who was basically like a propagandist for jihadist causes around the world. And Samir Khan's family, I got to know them, and they had been told by the FBI that Samir, there's no charges against Samir Khan, but they're very concerned about what he's up to in Yemen. They wanted him to come home, and he had found his way to Anwar Awlaki and was sort of like his assistant or something. So these guys are in this house. While the CIA is monitoring it, and they're watching through the satellites, and they're waiting for President Obama to sign off on the hit against Anwar Awlaki, this was a big deal in the White House because this was the first time that they were going to assassinate a U.S. citizen. Assassinate is my word, not theirs. They call it targeted killing or liquidating the enemy, but it is assassination. So the U.S. is contemplating it, and Obama ultimately says, I want to take him out, and becomes prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner of Anwar Awlaki. While they're monitoring that house and these discussions are going on, Awlaki's eldest son, Abdul Rahman, who hasn't seen his father in years and is a totally normal teenager living with his grandparents in Sana'a, and likes hip-hop music, goes to the square with the young nonviolent revolutionaries, and was really close to his younger siblings. And I got deep into who that kid is, and I know that he wasn't involved with anything vaguely resembling terrorism, and that he wasn't in any touch with his father. A few days after he turned 16, he sneaks into his mother's bedroom one morning and steals $40 from her purse, the equivalent of $40 in Yemeni riyals. And then he climbs out the window of the kitchen and goes to the bus station in Bab el-Yemen, in the old city in Sana'a, and takes a bus to Shebwa, where he thinks his father is. And his idea is to try to ask around and see if anyone can find him, because he wants to speak to his father, wants to see his father, and he felt like turning 16 was a moment where he was a man and could go and do this. And he had a very different recollection of who his dad was, and sees reports of his father being compared to Osama bin Laden, and is this great terrorist. And so the kid runs away to look for his dad. And while he's in Shebwa looking for his father is killed hundreds of miles away in the north of Yemen. And so the grandparents call him, who are effectively his parents at this point, and they said, Abdul Rahman, you have to come home, your father's dead. And at the time, there was a revolution in Yemen, and there was fighting in that part of the country, and the roads were blocked, and he had to stay. He couldn't go back, so he had to stay for a couple of weeks. And so on October 14th, 2011, he's out at dinner with his cousin Ahmed, who's 17, and a bunch of other young people from the tribe, and a drone appears above them and launches a missile and blows them up, and killing this kid and a group of other teenagers. And you had 3 U.S. citizens that were killed in a 2-week period in these operations authorized by the president. The killing of Anwar Awlaki, I think was a turning point, but I understand why the U.S. wanted to kill him, and his family understands why the U.S. wanted to kill him. And there was nothing but praise from Washington, Democrats and Republicans alike, for killing Anwar Awlaki. And almost no one seemed concerned about the fact that we had just killed a U.S. citizen who had never been charged with a crime, who the United States had never sought to extradite, and never presented any public evidence against him, killed him without any trial, and he was not on on a battlefield shooting at U.S. soldiers. To me, it was a significant moment in our history. We can debate what we think about that strategically or legally, but I believe it was significant, particularly because a popular constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning president was the one that authorized it. But then 2 weeks later, the killing of this kid, the White House has never explained why Rahman Awlaki was killed. I've spent months and months of my life working on trying to get an answer. At one point, a U.S. military official leaked to the press that he was actually 21 years old. Well, then we went and got his birth certificate from the state of Colorado. He had just turned 16, as the family alleged. Then they said, well, he was at a meeting, at an al-Qaeda meeting, and yet they couldn't produce a single name of someone from al-Qaeda that they killed at this meeting. And then they said, well, he was meeting with this guy, Ibrahim al-Bana, who was a propagandist for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And then it turns out Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive and wasn't there. So why was this kid killed? I recently met a former senior official of the Obama administration who told me that when President Obama had been briefed on that strike, the one that killed this kid, that he had been told by the CIA and military intelligence that Ibrahim al-Bana was there alone, and no one mentioned anything about the Awlaki kid being there. And this former official told me that Brennan, John Brennan, who at the time was the senior counterterrorism advisor and is now the CIA director, that Brennan believed that it was an intentional hit on the kid, and ordered a review. And that review, I tried to inquire with the White House, the National Security Council. To my knowledge, has never been published. So the official that told me all of this, said to me, "Look, I assure you, this was just a mistake. It's just a mistake. It was collateral damage." And I said, "Well, if you have evidence to that effect, and that's true, why not just say it? Because it really does seem like an impossible coincidence. I say at one point in our film, it's like a tale from Greek mythology. You kill the father and then the son." And at the end of the day, we don't know why he was killed. But I asked this official, why don't you just say, if it's collateral damage, that that's what it was? And if you did kill someone that you think was plotting against the United States, then say it, so that at least that family knows. And I think also the American people have a right to know. Because this is serious business when you're drone striking American teenagers that have never been charged with anything. And if it's just because his last name is Awlaki, then that's just stunning. So he's assuring me all this, and he said, well, look at it this way. This is a former senior White House official. We had just killed 3 U.S. citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets. It didn't look good. It was embarrassing. That was his answer. It was embarrassing. I mean, that to me is just sort of shocking. When Robert Gibbs, who's the former White House press secretary, was asked during the 2012 election campaign when he was serving as a senior surrogate for President Obama, he was his major spokesperson, he was asked by this young reporter named Sierra Adamson about the killing of Rahman Awlaki. And you know what Gibbs said? He said he should have had a more responsible father. I mean, there are few things in history more shameful than blaming the death of a child on who their parents were. And you can go and see that. It's on YouTube, and it's been, it's gone all around. I mean, he should be ashamed of himself for saying that. Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, was on CNN after that killing and was asked about the killings of Anwar Awlaki, Samir Khan, and Rahman Awlaki. And Harry Reid said to Candy Crowley, I do know this. If there were 3 Americans that deserved to be killed, it was those 3. And I tried to get Harry Reid's office to comment. I said, are you really saying that this 16-year-old kid needed to be killed? What evidence do you have he was involved with anything threatening the United States? And they wouldn't answer. And then I went after them on Twitter, and then they blocked me. And there was no it was a badge of pride that I was blocked by Harry Reid. So it's mystifying to me that we don't have an answer on who killed this kid. And I think that we're going to look back on this moment in time and realize that a lot of us were asleep at the wheel and weren't really being responsible citizens because we just kind of trusted that Obama was going to do the right thing. And I imagine, Darth Vader, Cheney, sitting fly fishing somewhere and kind of chuckling, having a good chuckle about this and saying it's a good thing that Obama, cleaned this up for everyone, because now these policies can continue when Rubio or Jeb Bush or whoever is going to come back into power. And I think that a big part of our problem as a society is that we don't see people in Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia as human beings whose stories are worthy of being told or demanding our attention. And I think if we had empathy, if we saw them as equals and that our lives are not worth more than them, I think it would be a lot harder have these policies continue. I think we'd have a more rigorous debate in our society. I watched the Boston Marathon bombing aftermath, just with my jaw on the floor at how terrible the media coverage was. And the smearing and tarring of the reputation of that young high school track kid who Rupert Murdoch put his picture on the New York Post and said, "Bagman, these are who the feds are looking for." And this high school track runner, I mean, it's shocking that he actually went to the marathon because he liked to run and wanted to watch the marathon. And somehow because he had brown skin, he becomes a suspect in this in the eyes of one of the most powerful media moguls in history. And there's so much misinformation, and there's just this rush to judgment always. When Oklahoma City was bombed, the first thing was it's got to be Islamic radicals that did this, and the hysteria around this also. And I don't know the motivations of the people that did this bombing. I mean, the story of the Tsarnaev, guys. I mean, I want to see it all play out in court. I want to know the evidence, and I want whoever did this to be brought to justice, whatever their motivation was. But I also want to understand why they did it, because I think that's important. But there was a part of the media coverage that was remarkable. And that is the stories of the heroes that responded to the bombing, like this guy Carlos Arredondo, who ran toward the blast after it happened. And his son had been killed in Iraq as a soldier. And Carlos Arredondo, I know him. He's a brilliant guy and a brave man and a noble citizen. And he runs toward the blast, and there's that iconic picture of him. I'm sure all of you have seen it, where he has the cowboy hat on and he's running the double amputee. Guy, both of his legs are blown off, and he's trying to save his life, and he's tying his leg to try to stop the bleeding, and watching Carlos Arredondo talk about this, and also knowing that he has lost so much in his own life. I mean, it's just this remarkable human story that I think all of us can relate to and say that's an amazing person. And then we had the story of the kid the 8-year-old kid, and that beautiful painting that he did that went viral on Facebook, and we know his story and what his dreams were, and the Chinese graduate student. I was with a friend from China recently when I was giving a talk in Boston, and it was right after the Boston Marathon bombing, and this friend from China said, when President Obama said her name, the name of this Chinese woman who was a graduate student in the U.S., there was a blog post that went viral in China, and the title of it was "Where You Die Matters," and the point of it was that if she had died in a factory explosion, making iPhones for Americans, her name wouldn't have been mentioned by the most powerful man on the planet. But because she died in Boston, her life mattered, and that struck me as as profound, because if you think about the reason why we have the response to the school shootings, and I remember I was devastated when the New York Times put the list of all of the kids killed at Newtown, and you just saw 5 years old, 6 years old, 6 years old. I mean, it's you can't not cry when you actually internalize it, because you think, what if that was my child? And in thinking about it, I've spent so much time in Afghanistan and Somalia and Yemen, and I have these faces of kids that I've met there, and their parents were blown up, or some of them have been maimed in a missile strike, and or they're orphaned, or I've met women whose entire families have been killed, and I wonder, what if we knew their stories? What if we knew that little girl, what she, who was killed in a bombing in December of '09 in a U.S. cruise missile strike? What if we saw the picture that she had painted, or knew the dream that she had? Well, then it doesn't become collateral damage in a strike aimed at killing dangerous terrorists. Then it becomes real people that we relate to. The reason why these school shootings strike us so hard is that we feel it as though it's our own people. But we should extend that right also to the people that live on the other side of the missiles that are being launched from our country. And the last thing I'll say is, last night I did an event at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, and they always ask at the end of it for a 60-second idea to change the world. And I had forgotten that I was supposed to come up with something ahead of time, and I had forgotten. What I ended up saying was, I don't know that it would change the world, but I think it would be an important exercise for all of us to engage in. And I realized that part of why I do this is because I've long been engaged with this, and it really has changed the way I see the world, is if we all adopt the story of someone who has either lost their lives or lost something deep as a result of our wars, and to know their story, so that when we're talking about it and we say we defend the drone strikes, that we also can talk fluently about a case where it went wrong, or about a case where the death of someone could potentially come back to inspire new enemies to want to attack us. Because if we have empathy, if only through empathy can you actually care about someone enough to stand up and say, I'm not going to let that happen to them, or I don't want that to happen anymore. It's why so many Americans now are paying attention to the gun debate. It is because we don't want this to happen ever again in our schools. And so I think our challenge really is all of us are busy, and a lot of people in this country are struggling, and it's a hard ask to say to a single mother, in Tennessee who's struggling to put food on the table for her kids, care about, what goes on in Yemen. People are struggling here, and I know that, but I think that for those of us that have the luxury of some free time in our life, that the least we could do is to actually personalize these wars. It shouldn't just be families with loved ones in the military that have to pay attention to what's happening in Afghanistan. We're paying for it. We're paying for it financially, and we're paying for it morally. And I think that if we ignore the potential impact of these policies, we do it at our own peril. I have much more faith in my fellow country people than I do in the jokers on Capitol Hill. And I think that if we start a Hearts and Minds campaign in our own country to actually realize who's being killed and who's not being killed, who are we actually targeting here? Are we safer or less safe because of the drone strike policy and the signature strike policy? What would an actual national security policy look like? It should be all of our business. And with that, I thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions or hear any comments, but it's really an honor to be with you, and thank you.
Hi, Ed. I want to thank you for so many thought-provoking observations and ideas. One idea that I would like to ask you to answer maybe a little bit more, and I say this because I'm conflicted about it. I don't know the answer. You've clearly thought about it a lot more than I have. Why does it matter, or does it matter, that Awlaki, the father, was a citizen of America? Like, does that make it worse that we assassinated him? Because your empathy suggests, your argument suggests that actually it doesn't matter. We shouldn't have assassinated anybody.
That's a great answer. I'm glad that you asked that, and I often do try to make the point. I mean, on a moral level, there should not be any difference between how we view the rights of citizens and non-citizens to not be killed in a drone strike, particularly if they haven't had any actual charges against them, or there isn't evidence to prove that they are involved with the plots that we say they are. The reason why I raise the Awlaki issue is that I think there's another dimension to this that cuts to the heart of who we are as a society, and how we treat the most reprehensible of our citizens. I think speaks volumes to who I'm more concerned with, who we are, than who Awlaki was. And if in some cases, with Jahar Tsarnaev in Boston, the Republicans were calling, said we want him treated as an enemy combatant, and some said we want him shipped to Guantanamo. And when in defending the Awlaki thing, they say, well, he didn't have actual rights to due process because he was a terrorist, and that's the line on it. To me, if we're going to allow the mob to grab the pitchforks and torches and go and deliver citizens justice in certain cases, then we should stop saying that we're a nation based on the rule of law, and that there are certain circumstances where the mob is allowed to sort of enforce justice and we don't actually need to abide by our own laws. And I think that if you allow that line to be crossed, and this happens to our own citizens, then I think that that there is a serious constitutional crisis. I unfortunately agreed with Rand Paul. I wish there was a more credible person that had done this in the Senate when he was raising some legitimate questions. There was also a lot of craziness that day when he did the filibuster, but he raised some legitimate questions. But on a moral level, I don't think there's any difference whatsoever between doing this to an American or a non-American. You have a response? Yes.
Well, it's not a response so much, but just to make sure I understand things a little bit better. So you're saying, specifically in this case, you want to see us following our own laws, and that is an important aspect of the argument.
Yeah,
rather
I think
than the fact that he was an American citizen. It's
right. I mean, this is a bigger picture idea, but I think that we should demilitarize our response to terrorism and view it as a crime, and view terror plots as crimes, not acts of war. I mean, I think that we have a robust justice system in this country that has been the only vehicle for actually bringing people to justice is when they're tried in the civilian system. Guantanamo has been a catastrophic disaster. I believe that our society would be stronger if Anwar Awlaki had been charged and indicted and his extradition demanded. And if we can't get him after having done all of that, then the U.S. has all sorts of options, some of which would be military in nature. But to just skip right to the death penalty before even indicting someone, to me, I think that's something we have to be really nervous about in our society. I think that I think it would have been much wiser for the U.S. to charge Anwar Awlaki, and I think he potentially could have been put on trial. I think that there would have been an incentive for people to give him up, and so others might debate that, but I know that tribe well. They would have given him up, I believe, if the U.S. put pressure on them or figured out a way to make it worth their while. Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems like a large part of your argument is a pragmatic one, that we're creating more terrorists by killing accidentally or negligently some civilians. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that played out when the U.S. was involved militarily in Central and South America in the 70s, 80s, and so on.
Wait, can you rephrase it? So you're asking the
I'm asking about the blowback
right.
That CIA involvement in Central and South America
right.
had,
yeah.
and if that, how that changes your opinion about the blowback that we might experience as a result of drone strikes.
Yeah. I think the legacy of what the U.S. did in the 70s, 80s in Central America is still felt to this day. I mean, right now there's the trial of Rios Montt in Guatemala, and the U.S. was supporting these murderous juntas and the people have spent decades trying to get justice for what had been lost. And the Contra death squads in Nicaragua and Battalion 316 in Honduras, I think it really sparked a lot of anti-American hatred. Whether or not there was specific blowback from that, I don't know in terms of Americans being attacked inside of the United States. I also think that there was a different mentality in those countries than there is in a lot of Muslim countries around the world in terms of the way that the wars are being fueled. The U.S. in Central America was primarily serving as working with proxies, and the U.S., with the exception of the mining of the Nicaraguan harbor, where the U.S. had a guilty verdict against it at the World Court for having done that. The U.S. tried to use proxy forces and more covert presence. I think the drones are a great recruiting tool for Al Qaeda or other militant organizations because it's very good branding, and so I do fear that we are giving the perception that we're at war with Islam, and I think that is really just very, very dangerous. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for coming. Very quick technical question. When you mentioned Amina was a convert from the Catholic to Islam, where did you get that information?
Yeah, I read Serbo-Croatian. Actually, I can speak Serbo-Croatian, and there was extensive coverage in the Croatian media about who she is, and I mean very, very like technical details about her life and her work and her conversion to Islam. And
I read too, so maybe you can tell me later which publication that was. Thanks.
Yeah. There were a number of exposés about her in the local press in Croatia and in Serbia. There was some reporting on it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Two questions, and you answered half of the first one. Was you consider the alternatives, and the alternatives you suggested were to bring them here and face our civil justice system, but there may be something else, because that seems to me like a very steep battle to fight, or a disadvantageous battle to fight, when you've got some kind of compelling evidence to bring against him. And the second one is, as I've traveled through the Middle East, what I see is America gets the blame, and it's unjustified blame. Really what happens is they see the United States as an oppressor when it's really their own government as an oppressor, because the foreign aid that gets there is somewhat diffused. It's siphoned off by the people that are powers that be. And there doesn't seem to be any correction for that type of activity. And that's essentially what's spawning, in my opinion, that's what spawns this anti-American sentiment.
I agree with you. I mean, I think you're. I don't necessarily agree with saying that that's the actual thing, and that it has nothing to do with the U.S.'s actions. But I agree strongly with your sentiment that these regimes. I mean, the overthrow of Mubarak, in Egypt, for instance. I mean, he was a widely despised man for what he had done to his own people, but people are also aware that he stayed in power in part because of his tremendous support from the United States through successive administrations. And we've given a lot of military aid to the Jordanians, to the Egyptians, to at times we worked with Bashar al-Assad in Syria when it was convenient for us, the Saudis, the Yemenis, and I think that it's a double punch. I think people perceive the United States as being on the side of these dictatorships and not on the side of ordinary people. I've certainly heard that in the countries that I've been talking about today. But I do think, though, that the U.S. has a long, or I know that the U.S. has a long track record of bolstering these dictatorships. The Bahraini regime, the Saudis. I mean, we are a big part of that problem. But I do think that those regimes deserve their fair share of the blame for what they've been involved with.
Now, one last thing. U.S. presence in the Gulf and the Middle East during the Iran-Iraq war was a huge stabilizing factor in the region. And as we start to withdraw, there's all sorts of upheaval going on over there. So there seems to be consequences for no matter going forward or going in reverse. There appear to be consequences either way.
Right. Well, I mean, I have a little bit of you and I could have a debate club here. I have a little bit of a different take on the Iran-Iraq thing. I mean, Kissinger famously said we should arm them both so they can kill each other off. I mean, I think we were a highly destabilizing presence, particularly in Iraq. I mean, the U.S. was supporting Saddam Hussein in the 80s when he was at his most brutal. And Donald Rumsfeld went over as an envoy in '83 and gave Saddam golden cowboy spurs from a gift from Ronald Reagan, and they removed the Iraqi government from the list of state sponsors of terrorism so that they could sell them weapons that were then used to use chemical weapons on the Kurdish population in the north of Iraq. And I think that you can jump into history midway and then say, well, the U.S. was stabilizing, and the U.S. was a big part of creating that, of making that war possible, the Iran-Iraq war.
I sort of agree with you to a degree on that. So.
Yeah, but
anyway,
your broader point, though, about the withdrawal. I mean, look, in Afghanistan, I think there are pockets of Afghanistan where people are grateful that the United States went in and got rid of the thugs from the Taliban, and girls can go to school, and and women are not living in constant fear of being attacked. But then there are large parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban are still in control, and there's the added hostility of U.S. night raids or strikes that are happening, and they're sort of getting punched from both sides. So I do think that when there's a withdrawal from Afghanistan, there will be a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, I think we have to look back and say, what was the point of any of this? I don't know anyone in the military today that the guys that are being tasked with fighting the war that think that it's a good idea to be there. I mean, most Americans supported us going into Afghanistan early on after 9/11. At this point, I think the majority of Americans are sort of like, what's the point of this now? Like, who are we fighting anymore?
I'll try to make it brief. First, thank you very much and for the fantastic reporting and all this incredibly dangerous hard work you do. And it's sort of related to that. I mean, especially, as you've done what, could be termed kind of exposés or what would normally be called just good investigative journalism. If you talk about Blackwater and all these people who I think, in the U.S. government and drone strikes and things where people tend to think, I think they believe they operate sort of above the law. How much do you actually fear for your personal safety, aside from the people that are dangerous that you're normally
Did Jay Leno put you up to this or something?
No, I don't listen to Jay Leno.
No, I'm just kidding. No, he asked me the same question on a
really?
TV show once, and
now I feel bad.
It scared my mom to death. Why does Jay Leno think someone's going to kill you? No, I always get embarrassed when people ask me that. I mean, I appreciate your kind words, but I was talking to a colleague earlier today. I mean, there are journalists that are missing in Syria. This young guy who's a former Marine named Austin Tice has been missing in Syria for over a year. We believe that he's being held by the Assad government. He was a reporter from McClatchy News Service. Record numbers of journalists are being. One of the most dangerous places on earth to be a journalist is Mexico. Mexican journalists that report on the drug cartels are just being bumped off and assassinated left and right. Journalists in Somalia are being murdered by various sides of the fighting factions there, and I always get embarrassed because I live in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. I live in Park Slope, the land of lattes and baby strollers and double wide baby strollers, and I get to come back, and that's where I am, and I know that I'm safe there, and so many of our colleagues that are in these places their lives they live in a constant state of danger, and I always try to recognize their sacrifice because I think they are the actual heroes of all this. It's why my book is dedicated to journalists locked up for doing their job or who died in pursuit of the truth. Because a lot of times, people like me, I go on MSNBC and I talk and people know my name and I have a book on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's like, what about Abdul Shaya, this journalist who's in prison in Yemen, in part because President Obama told the Yemeni government he wants him locked up for having exposed a U.S. missile attack. I mean, I'm no Braveheart. I mean, my colleagues in Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Libya, everywhere else, those are the real heroes, and we don't know their name because they're not reporting in English necessarily, or they're behind the scenes. You know, if I see Thomas Friedman quote one more time as taxi driver, as concierge, I'm going to go and shave his mustache myself. I mean, I'm so tired of the sort of pontificating there, because there are real journalists that do serious work, and they get almost no credit for it.
No doubt.
But thank you very much for the compliment. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Jeremy, just wanted to say thank you so much, everybody. If we could give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for people watching.